The red dust of Kara's Ridge blew across the landing pad as Staff Sergeant James Mitchell watched the last supply shuttle disappear into the amber sky. He stood with his arms crossed, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. 4 to 7 Marines under his watch. 15,000 civilians counting on them. One small military base at the edge of human space. "That's the last one, Staff Sergeant," said Corporal Thomas Wright, walking up beside him. Thomas was a good soldier, reliable and steady. He had seen combat before, unlike half the platoon. No more supplies coming for at least 6 weeks. Maybe longer if headquarters forgets about us. James nodded but said nothing. He had been a Marine for 12 years, long enough to know when the higher-ups considered a place not worth defending. Kara's Ridge was just a mining colony. It had valuable minerals, but it was far from the core worlds. The kind of place where they sent whoever they could spare. "Get everyone together in the command room," James finally said. 2 o'clock sharp. "We need to talk." "Yes, Staff Sergeant." As Thomas walked away, James looked out at the landscape beyond the fence. Red rocks stretched for miles, broken up by deep valleys and strange stone formations. It was beautiful in a harsh way. His wife Margaret would have loved taking pictures here. But Margaret was gone now, 3 years dead in a transport accident. James had thrown himself into his work ever since, volunteering for every dangerous assignment, anything to keep his mind busy. His communication device beeped. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, we need you in operations. Priority alert." James pressed the button. "On my way." The operations center was busy when he arrived. Lieutenant Henry Davis, the base commander, stood over a glowing table showing a map of space around their planet. His face looked pale in the blue light. "Sir." James stepped closer. Henry didn't look up. Long-range sensors found something at the edge of the system. 23 ships, maybe more. They came out of faster-than-light travel 30 minutes ago. James felt his heart beat faster. Pirates? No. Henry zoomed in on the display. The ships were huge and looked organic, covered in what appeared to be living tissue. Computer says they matched Krath swarm patterns. Everyone in the room went quiet. The Krath were monsters. Insect creatures controlled by a hive mind. They had been attacking colony worlds for 2 years, leaving nothing alive behind them. The galactic community had been slow to fight back. Humanity especially was seen as weak, too new to space travel to be real warriors. "How long before they get here?" James asked. 48 hours. Could be less. Henry stood up straight, his jaw tight. "I sent out distress calls. Fleet Command says the closest battle group is 3 weeks away." 3 weeks. James looked at the hologram, counting the enemy ships. Each one could carry thousands of Krath fighters. "Sir, we can't hold for 3 weeks against that." "I know." Henry met his eyes. "But we can hold long enough to get the civilians out. Get them to the transport ships before the Krath land." James understood. They were being asked to die so others could live. But that was the job. "I'll get the Marines ready, sir." At exactly 2 o'clock, James stood before his platoon. 4 to 7 faces stared back at him. Some were scarred veterans who had seen death before. Others were young and nervous. Private Emily Watson, barely 19 years old, sat in the front row with her hands clasped tight. Corporal Robert Hayes, the medic, leaned against the wall. Sergeant William Parker, an old warrior with more scars than hair, chewed on an unlit cigar. "Listen up," James said loudly. "Long-range sensors detected Krath ships entering our system. We have 48 hours, maybe less, before they arrive." People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Fleet Command knows. Help is coming, but it won't get here in time. Our mission is simple. Hold the line long enough for civilian transports to evacuate. 15,000 people need to get off this planet alive. That's our job. Private George Turner, a thick-built kid from Earth, raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, how many Krath are we talking about?" James didn't sugarcoat it. "Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands." Nobody spoke. "We're outnumbered," James continued. "We don't have enough weapons or soldiers. The smart thing would be to leave with the civilians and let the Krath have this place." He paused. "But we're not going to do that. We're Marines. We don't run. We hold the line. Every hour we fight is another 1,000 civilians getting on ships. Every minute we stand is another family that survives." He looked at each person. "I won't lie. This will be the hardest fight of your lives. Some of us won't make it home. But when people talk about Kara's Ridge in the future, They'll say we did our duty. They'll say we held the line. Sergeant William Parker bit his cigar and grinned. Oorah! Oorah! Everyone shouted together, their voices filling the room. James felt grim satisfaction. They were afraid. He was afraid too. But they would fight. That's what Marines did. The next 2 days were spent preparing. They built defensive walls along Thermopylae Pass, a narrow canyon leading to the colony. Artillery guns were set up and tested. Ammunition was moved to forward positions. The 2 old gunships, Hammer and Anvil, were prepared for air support. James walked the defensive line, checking every position. He stopped at Emily Watson's foxhole. The young private was nervously checking her rifle again and again. "How are you doing, Watson?" James asked. She jumped, startled. "Fine, Staff Sergeant." "Ready?" James could see fear in her eyes. "First deployment?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "You'll do fine. Remember your training. Stay low, choose your targets carefully, and keep moving. If you freeze, you die. Understood?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant." 36 hours after the first warning, the sky above Kara's Ridge turned dark. Krath drop pods fell like burning meteors, streaking through the atmosphere. Dozens. Hundreds. They crashed into the ground miles away, throwing up huge clouds of dust. James stood in the command center, watching the display light up with enemy signals. "They're landing everywhere," Lieutenant Henry said. "Setting up positions before the main attack." "Scouts," Thomas said grimly. "Testing us." "Then let's show them what we're made of," James said. He opened communications to all units. "If it's not human, kill it." The first Krath scouts approached an hour later. They were nightmare creatures with hard shells, multiple legs, moving fast despite their size. Their mandibles clicked as they rushed forward in a black and green wave. "Contact!" Sergeant Williams' voice crackled. "Enemy soldiers, 300 meters. All positions, fire." James commanded. The canyon exploded with gunfire. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness. Plasma bolts burst in green flames. Gunship Hammer roared overhead, firing its cannons. The craft died by dozens, but more kept coming. The battle lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the canyon was filled with alien bodies. 4 wounded, none critical, Robert reported. "We held." James looked at the destruction. This was just the beginning. "Good work, Marines," he said. "But don't relax. That was just scouts. The real fight starts tomorrow." As night fell, James stood alone on the tower, watching the horizon. In the distance, he saw the glow of hundreds of Krath landing zones burning like evil stars. Dawn broke over Kara's Ridge with an eerie silence. James Mitchell stood on the observation tower, drinking bitter coffee from a metal cup. His eyes scanned the horizon where the Krath landing zones still glowed faintly in the morning light. The calm felt wrong, like the universe was holding its breath before screaming. "Staff Sergeant, you should eat something," Corporal Robert Hayes said, climbing up beside him with a ration pack. The medic looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. Nobody had slept much. "Not hungry," James replied. He raised his binoculars and looked toward Thermopylae Pass. The defensive positions looked solid, but he knew appearances meant nothing against what was coming. "Sir, the civilians are boarding transports now," Thomas Wright's voice crackled through the radio. "First group should lift off in 2 hours." "Good. Keep me updated." James lowered the binoculars and turned to Robert. "How are the wounded from yesterday?" "Stable. Private Anderson took shrapnel in his leg, but he'll live. Wants to stay on the line." "Tell him no. He goes with the first civilian transport." James didn't want heroics from injured men. Dead heroes couldn't hold a line. Robert nodded and headed down the tower ladder. James took another sip of coffee and watched the sun climb higher. Beautiful morning for a war. The first alarm sounded at 0830 hours. Sensors picked up massive movement from the north. James grabbed his rifle and ran to the command center where Lieutenant Henry Davis was already coordinating defenses. "Report," James barked. "Multiple contacts, coming fast," Henry said, pointing at the holographic display. Red dots covered the map like a spreading infection. "Estimate 3,000 hostiles, moving toward Thermopylae Pass." 3,000. James felt his stomach tighten. "All units, battle stations. This is not a drill." He grabbed his helmet and ran outside. Marines were already moving to their positions, weapons ready. The 2 gunships, Hammer and Anvil, lifted off with a roar of engines. Private Emily Watson stood at her position, gripping her rifle so tight her knuckles were white. "Watson, breathe," James said as he passed her. "Remember your training." She nodded but said nothing. Her eyes were wide with fear. James reached the forward observation post where Sergeant William Parker was looking through a scope. The old Marine's face was grim. "There," William said, pointing. "See that dust cloud?" James looked. A massive brown cloud was rising in the distance, moving toward them like a sandstorm. But it wasn't sand. It was the Krath. "Holy Mother of God," someone whispered. The Krath came in a wave of chittering, clicking horror. Thousands of them, moving on multiple legs, their black shells gleaming in the sunlight. Some were small and fast. Others were huge, the size of transport vehicles, with massive claws that could tear through metal. They didn't move like an army. They moved like a flood, overwhelming everything in their path. "All units, hold your fire until they reach the markers," James commanded, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "Make every shot count." The Krath reached the first marker at 400 meters. They kept coming. 300 meters. 200. "Fire!" James screamed. The canyon exploded into chaos. Machine guns roared, spitting thousands of rounds into the advancing horde. Artillery shells whistled overhead and detonated in the enemy ranks, throwing bodies into the air. Plasma rifles burned through chitin and flesh. The gunships dove from above, their cannons tearing bloody lines through the Krath formation. But they kept coming. "They're not stopping." Private George Turner shouted, firing his rifle as fast as he could reload. "Keep firing." William Parker bellowed. "Don't let them reach the walls." A group of Krath broke through on the left flank. Fast ones, moving like spiders on crack. They rushed toward a foxhole where 3 Marines were positioned. James saw Private Emily Watson freeze, her rifle hanging limp in her hands. "Watson, fire!" James screamed. She didn't move. The Krath were 20 meters away. 15. 10. James sprinted toward her position, firing as he ran. He dropped 2 Krath, but more were coming. A massive warrior reared up, its mandibles spread wide, ready to tear Emily apart. Suddenly, Emily moved. She raised her rifle and fired point-blank into the creature's face. Once. Twice. 3 times. It collapsed at her feet, twitching. She kept firing into its body, her face twisted with terror and rage. "Watson, fall back to secondary position," James ordered, grabbing her shoulder. She blinked, seeming to wake from a nightmare, and nodded. The battle raged for 3 hours. The Marines gave ground slowly, falling back from one defensive position to the next. Bodies piled up in the canyon, most of them Krath. The stench of burned flesh and alien blood filled the air. "Staff Sergeant, we're running low on ammunition," Thomas reported, his face covered in soot and blood that wasn't his. "Ration it." "Controlled bursts only," James said. He looked at the tactical display. The Krath were finally pulling back, leaving hundreds of their dead behind. "They're withdrawing." "We did it," someone said. "We held them." "For now," William Parker said, reloading his weapon. "They'll be back." James counted heads. 7 Marines wounded. 2 critical. Corporal David Miller had taken a claw to the chest and was being worked on by Robert Hayes. The medic's hands were covered in blood, moving with practiced efficiency. "Save him, Doc," James said quietly. "Doing my best, Staff Sergeant." James walked the line, checking on his people. They were exhausted, covered in dirt and blood, but they were alive. Private Emily Watson sat in her foxhole, staring at her hands. They were shaking. "You did good, Watson," James said. She looked up at him, tears streaking through the grime on her face. "I froze. I almost got everyone killed. But you didn't. When it mattered, you fought. That's what counts." "I was so scared." "We all were. Fear doesn't make you weak. Running makes you weak. You stood your ground." She wiped her eyes and nodded. James returned to the command center where Lieutenant Henry was reviewing sensor data. His expression made James's blood run cold. "What is it?" Henry pointed at the screen. "Satellite imagery shows more Krath landing sites. Dozens of them. And the other human outposts across the continent have gone dark. All of them." "What do you mean, gone dark?" "No communications. No signals. Nothing." Henry met his eyes. "I think we're the last ones left." James felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. They weren't just defending Kara's Ridge anymore. They were the only thing standing between the craft and 15,000 civilians. How long until the next transport lifts off? James asked. 4 hours. They're loading now. Then we hold for 4 hours. James grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. And then we hold for 4 more after that. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky red and orange. In the distance, James could see movement. The craft were regrouping, gathering for another assault. There were more of them now. Many more. Sergeant William Parker walked up beside him, lighting his cigar with shaking hands. They're going to hit us harder next time. I know. We might not hold. We will. James checked his weapon and looked at his Marines. Tired, scared, but still standing. Still ready. We're Marines. We hold the line. 3 days. 72 hours of hell. James Mitchell couldn't remember the last time he had slept more than 20 minutes. His uniform was stiff with dried blood and sweat. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. Around him, his Marines looked like walking corpses, hollow-eyed and stumbling. The craft attacked in waves, day and night, never giving them rest. Every time the Marines thought they had a moment to breathe, sensors would scream warnings and another horde would come pouring through the canyon. The defensive positions at Thermopylae Pass were holding, but barely. The walls were scorched and cracked. Bodies of both humans and craft littered the ground. Staff Sergeant, we're down to 30% ammunition, Thomas Wright said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. A bandage covered half his face where a piece of shrapnel had caught him yesterday. Artillery has maybe 6 shells left. The gunships are running on fumes. James nodded slowly, too tired to feel panic anymore. What about the civilians? Transport 7 lifted off an hour ago. That's 9,000 evacuated. 6,000 still waiting. How many more transports? 3. Maybe 4 if we can repair the one that took damage during the last raid. James did the math in his head. 4 more transports meant at least 12 more hours. Probably longer. He looked at his Marines scattered across the defensive line. They had started with 4 to 7. Now they had 34 who could still fight. 13 dead or 2 wounded to continue. The numbers were grinding them down. Sir, we need to talk about falling back, Corporal Robert Hayes said, walking up with his medical kit. The medic looked worse than anyone, having not stopped working since the fighting began. His hands were permanently stained red. The men are exhausted. We can't keep this pace. Fall back where? James asked. There's nowhere to go. We pull back, the craft get through. They get through, they reach the spaceport. They reach the spaceport, everyone dies. If we stay here, we all die anyway, Private George Turner said. The young Marine's optimism had died somewhere during day 2. Now he just looked empty. Have you seen how many of them are out there? We kill 100 and 200 more show up. This is suicide. Several other Marines nodded. James could see the doubt spreading like poison through his unit. He had seen it before in other commands. Once men started thinking about retreat, actually holding became impossible. Listen to me, James said, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear. I know you're tired. I know this looks impossible. But every hour we stand here is another transport full of families getting away. Mothers. Children. People who can't fight for themselves. That's why we're here. We signed up to fight, not to die for nothing, someone muttered. Before James could respond, the alarm sounded again. Everyone groaned. James grabbed his rifle and moved to the observation post. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The craft had changed tactics. Instead of rushing straight at them, they were spreading out, flanking wide on both sides of the canyon. And in the center, something massive was moving forward. A creature the size of a building, covered in thick armor plating, with multiple limbs that ended in claws like steel beams. What in God's name is that? William Parker whispered. Battering ram, Thomas said. They're going to try to punch through our center. All positions, focus fire on the big one. James commanded. Don't let it reach the walls. The Marines opened up with everything they had. Bullets pinged harmlessly off the creature's armor. Plasma bolts left scorch marks but didn't penetrate. Artillery shells exploded around it, slowing it down but not stopping it. The monster kept coming, step by thunderous step. Meanwhile, smaller craft were swarming the flanks, trying to get around the defensive positions. Private Emily Watson and her fire team were on the left flank. James watched through his binoculars as wave after wave crashed against their position. Watson's position is being overrun, someone shouted. James grabbed his radio. Watson, fall back to secondary position. Negative, Staff Sergeant. Emily's voice came back, strained but determined. If we fall back, they'll get through. We can hold. Watson, that's an order. With respect, sir, screw the order. We hold the line. The radio went dead. James watched helplessly as Emily and her 3 Marines fought like demons. They had run out of ammunition and were using their rifles as clubs. Emily had a combat knife in each hand, stabbing anything that came close. One by one, her team members fell. But they held. The craft couldn't get through. Cover Watson's flank. James screamed. Get fire support down there now. Gunship Anvil dove from the sky, its cannons blazing, tearing through the craft surrounding Emily's position. The young private was covered in blood, both alien and her own, but she was still standing, still fighting. The massive craft creature reached the defensive wall and slammed into it. The entire structure shook. Cracks appeared in the reinforced concrete. It pulled back and hit again. The wall buckled. We can't stop it. Thomas yelled. James made a decision that would haunt him forever. He grabbed the radio connected to the artillery position. Fire mission. Coordinates 279er. Danger close. Sir, that's right on top of us, the artillery commander responded. I know. Fire everything you have left. Do it now. There was a pause. Then, yes, sir. James grabbed the base-wide radio. All units, take cover. Artillery incoming on our position. The Marines dove for whatever shelter they could find. James threw himself into a bunker just as the first shell screamed overhead. The explosion was deafening. Then another. And another. All 6 remaining artillery shells landed directly on the defensive wall where the massive craft creature was positioned. The monster disappeared in a cloud of fire and debris. When the smoke cleared, it was lying on its side, motionless. But the wall was gone too. There was nothing but rubble now, a gaping hole in their defenses. Rebuild that wall. James ordered, his ears ringing. Move, move, move. The Marines scrambled to pile rubble and wreckage into the gap. The craft were regrouping for another push. James could see thousands of them in the distance, gathering like a black tide. His radio crackled. Lieutenant Henry's voice came through. Staff Sergeant, I have new orders from Fleet Command. What are they? Hold for 48 more hours. The civilian evacuation needs more time. Transport repairs are taking longer than expected. 48 hours. James looked at his exhausted Marines, at their depleted ammunition, at the broken wall they were trying to rebuild with their bare hands. 48 hours was impossible. Understood, sir. We'll hold. He cut the connection and gathered his remaining Marines. 34 faces, some he knew well, some he had barely gotten to know before the fighting started. Emily Watson was there, limping, her arm bandaged but her eyes fierce. William Parker was there, his cigar long gone, replaced with grim determination. Thomas Wright. Robert Hayes. George Turner. All of them. Listen up, James said. We just got new orders. We hold for 48 more hours. He saw the disbelief in their faces. The despair. I won't lie to you. This is the hardest thing anyone will ever ask of us. Some of us won't see tomorrow. But every hour we hold is another 1,000 lives saved. We're not just fighting for ground anymore. We're showing the entire galaxy what humans are made of. We're showing them that we don't break. We don't run. We hold the line. He pulled out his combat knife and held it up. When we run out of bullets, we use these. When the knives break, we use our hands. When we can't stand anymore, we crawl. But we do not retreat. Not one step. Not 1 inch. Are you with me? There was a long silence. Then Emily Watson stepped forward. Oorah. William Parker grinned. Oorah. One by one, every Marine stepped forward. Oorah. 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 The sound echoed across the canyon. In the distance, the craft horde began to move forward again. James raised his rifle. Then let's show these bugs what Marines can do. The command bunker shook as another explosion rocked the ground above. Dust fell from the ceiling in streams. James Mitchell crouched over a flickering holographic display, watching red dots swarm across the map like angry insects. 19 Marines left. 19 out of 47. The numbers kept shrinking, and the craft kept coming. Staff Sergeant, the north wall just collapsed, Thomas Wright reported, blood running down his temple from a fresh wound. His left arm hung useless at his side, broken in 3 places. But he refused to evacuate. They're pouring through. Seal it with the damaged transport, James ordered. Block the gap with anything that moves. We already used everything we have. Then use bodies. Krath bodies. There's plenty of them. Thomas nodded and limped away. James looked at the tactical screen again. They had fallen back 3 times in the last 6 hours. Now they were at their final defensive position, the command bunker and the area around it. Half a kilometer from the spaceport where the last transports were loading civilians. If the Krath got through here, it was over. Corporal Robert Hayes stumbled into the bunker, his medical kit nearly empty. His face was gray with exhaustion. Staff Sergeant, I need to talk to you. Make it quick. It's about ammunition. We're out. James felt his stomach drop. Completely? Most positions have maybe 10 rounds left. Some have 5. Private Watson's squad has none. They're using rocks and Krath weapons they picked up. What about the gunships? Hammer went down 20 minutes ago. Pilot tried to ram a Krath cluster and succeeded. Anvil is still flying but has no ammunition left. Just using the ship itself as a battering ram now. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. No ammunition. No air support. 19 exhausted Marines against thousands of Krath. The math was impossible. How long until the last transport lifts off? James asked. Robert checked his watch. 90 minutes. Maybe 2 hours if they have problems. Then we hold for 2 hours. With what? We have nothing left to fight with. James pulled out his combat knife and slammed it into the table. We fight with these. With our hands if we have to. We fight until the transports are gone or we're all dead. Those are the only 2 options. Robert stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Oorah, Staff Sergeant. Outside the bunker, the situation was desperate. Marines crouched behind makeshift barricades built from rubble and wrecked vehicles. Some had improvised spears made from metal pipes. Others clutched Krath bioweapons they had scavenged, strange organic rifles that burned their hands but still fired. Private Emily Watson commanded a small group on the eastern flank. Her face was barely recognizable under the dirt and blood. She had tied a Krath mandible to a pole, creating a crude axe. 3 other Marines stood with her, all of them looking more like savages than soldiers. Here they come again, someone shouted. The Krath rushed forward in a black wave. Emily raised her makeshift weapon and screamed, a sound of pure rage and defiance. Her Marines echoed her cry and charged forward to meet the enemy. No bullets. No artillery. Just humans with primitive weapons against an alien horde. The fighting was brutal and close. Emily swung her axe, cutting through chitin and flesh. A Krath warrior grabbed her from behind. She spun and drove her elbow into what she hoped was its face. It squealed and released her. She kicked it backward and brought the axe down on its head. Another Marine went down, dragged under a pile of Krath. He detonated a grenade, his last act taking 6 enemies with him. The explosion threw Emily to the ground. Her ears rang. Everything moved in slow motion. She saw Sergeant William Parker 20 meters away, completely surrounded. The old Marine had lost his rifle and was fighting with just his knife. He was laughing, actually laughing, as he stabbed and slashed. Come on, you ugly bugs. Is that all you got? A massive Krath warrior crashed into him, its claws piercing his chest. William looked down at the claws sticking through his body, then looked up at the creature's face. He grinned, showing bloody teeth, and thrust his knife into the thing's eye. Oorah, he whispered, and both of them fell. No. Emily screamed. She ran toward him but more Krath blocked her path. In orbit above Kara's Ridge, Captain Frank Peterson watched the battle from his civilian transport ship, the Morning Star. He had already made 2 trips, evacuating 4,000 civilians. Now he was loading his 3rd and final group. But he could see the Marines below, fighting and dying. Captain, we need to leave, his co-pilot said. We're full. If we wait any longer, the Krath will shoot us down. Frank looked at the tactical screen showing the Marine positions. A tiny cluster of green dots surrounded by an ocean of red. As he watched, another green dot disappeared. What are our weapons? Frank asked. Sir, we're a civilian transport. We don't have weapons. We have engines. We have mass. We can drop. Frank grabbed the controls. Send a message to the Marines. Tell them we're coming in hot. Captain, that's suicide. Those Marines down there are dying for us. The least we can do is give them some help. Frank pushed the throttle forward. Hang on. The Morning Star dove from orbit, its engines screaming. Frank aimed for the thickest concentration of Krath forces. The ship shook as it hit atmosphere, heating up, pieces of hull plating beginning to glow red. On the ground, James received the message. A civilian ship was coming in to provide fire support. Not with weapons, but with the ship itself. All Marines, pull back 50 meters. James ordered. Now. The surviving Marines scrambled backward just as the Morning Star roared overhead, barely meters above the ground. The engine wash incinerated hundreds of Krath, turning them to ash. The ship banked hard and came around for another pass, its belly scraping the ground, crushing everything in its path. That crazy fool, Thomas said, watching in awe. The Morning Star made 3 passes before its engines finally gave out. Captain Frank Peterson managed to crash-land it directly in the middle of the Krath advance, creating a massive barrier of burning wreckage. The explosion killed thousands of the creatures and bought the Marines precious minutes. But more Krath were coming. Always more. James gathered his remaining Marines. 14 now. Corporal Robert Hayes had been killed trying to save a wounded soldier. Private George Turner had disappeared under a pile of enemies. Others had simply fallen, their bodies lost in the chaos. This is it, James said quietly. His rifle was empty, discarded somewhere in the fighting. He held only his knife now. The last transport lifts off in 30 minutes. We just need to hold for 30 more minutes. We're out of everything, Emily said. Her improvised axe was broken. She had only a small blade left. Then we use ourselves. James pulled out his combat knife and held it high. Fix bayonets. We're doing this the old-fashioned way. The 14 Marines moved to form a line. They had no ammunition, no grenades, no support. Just knives and determination. The Krath gathered in the distance, thousands of them, preparing for a final charge. Thomas Wright stood beside James, his good arm holding a knife. It's been an honor, Staff Sergeant. The honor was mine, James replied. Emily Watson took her position on the other side. Her hands were steady now, all fear burned away by days of combat. She looked at James and nodded once. The Krath began to move forward, a black tide of death. James raised his knife and screamed, a primal sound that came from somewhere deep in his soul. The other Marines joined him, their voices rising together. Oorah. They charged forward, 14 humans running toward thousands of aliens. Not because they thought they could win. Not because they wanted to die. But because 6,000 civilians still needed 30 more minutes, and Marines did not retreat. The two forces collided in a storm of violence. James stabbed and slashed, moving on pure instinct. He felt pain as claws tore his flesh, felt his own blood running hot down his arms, but he kept fighting. Kept moving. Beside him, his Marines did the same, selling their lives as dearly as possible. In the distance, James heard the sound of engines. The last transport was lifting off. They had done it. The civilians were safe. He smiled as a Krath claw pierced his side. At least they had held the line. James Mitchell woke to the sound of voices speaking in hushed tones. Everything hurt. His body felt like it had been torn apart and badly reassembled. He tried to open his eyes but only one would work. The other was covered with bandages. White ceiling. Clean walls. The smell of antiseptic. A hospital. He's awake, someone said. A face appeared above him. A doctor with kind eyes and gray hair. Easy, Staff Sergeant Mitchell. Don't try to move. You've been through quite an ordeal. James tried to speak but his throat was too dry. The doctor held a cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily, the cool liquid like heaven. Where am I? James croaked. Naval Medical Station, 3 systems away from Kara's Ridge. You've been unconscious for 6 days. My Marines. The others. Are they? The doctor's expression changed, became somber. 7 of you survived. The rescue fleet arrived just in time. Any longer and none of you would have made it. 7. Out of 47. James closed his eyes and felt tears leak from beneath his lids. So many dead. William Parker. Robert Hayes. George Turner. Faces flashed through his mind, Marines he had commanded, men and women who had trusted him to bring them home. The civilians, he whispered. All evacuated safely. 14,632 people made it off Kara's Ridge because of what you did. Every single civilian survived. James nodded slowly. That was something. That was worth it. But it didn't ease the crushing weight of guilt in his chest. Over the next week, James learned what had happened after he fell. The human fleet had arrived and driven off the Krath forces with overwhelming firepower. The aliens had scattered, retreating to their ships and fleeing the system. Kara's Ridge was devastated, the colony reduced to rubble and ash. But the people were alive. When James was strong enough to sit up, Lieutenant Henry Davis came to visit. The base commander looked older, his hair gone white at the temples. "Staff Sergeant," Henry said, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "I wanted to thank you personally. What you and your Marines did was extraordinary." "We just did our job, sir." "No. You did far more than that." Henry pulled out a data pad and showed James a news article. The headline read, "The Stand at Kara's Ridge, How 47 Marines Held Against 60,000. James stared at the numbers. 60,000 Krath. The estimates had been way off. They had faced 60,000 enemies with fewer than 50 soldiers. "The battle is being talked about across human space," Henry continued. "Other species in the galaxy are talking about it too. The Krath suffered losses they've never experienced before. 1 to 1,000 kill ratio. Military historians are calling it one of the greatest last stands in history." "It doesn't feel great, sir. It feels like we lost too many good people." Henry was quiet for a moment. Every one of those Marines volunteered to hold that line. They knew what it meant. And they did it anyway because that's what Marines do. Don't dishonor their sacrifice by thinking it was for nothing. After Henry left, James sat alone with his thoughts. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there. But maybe the lieutenant was right. Maybe the best way to honor the dead was to remember why they fought. 3 months later, James stood at a podium on Kara's Ridge. The colony had been rebuilt with surprising speed, the survivors determined to return to their home. Where the battlefield had been, where so many had died, now stood a memorial. 40 tall pillars of black stone, one for each Marine who had fallen. Their names were carved into the stone, along with the words, "They held the line." Thousands of people had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Civilians whose lives had been saved. Military personnel from across the fleet. Even representatives from other alien species who had come to pay their respects. James wore his dress uniform, his chest heavy with medals he didn't think he deserved. Beside him stood the 6 other survivors. Private Emily Watson, now promoted to sergeant, her face scarred but her eyes strong. Corporal Thomas Wright with his rebuilt arm. And 4 others, each carrying their own wounds, visible and invisible. "We gather here today," James began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "to remember the heroes of Kara's Ridge. 40 brave men and women who gave everything so that others could live." He paused, looking at the names carved in stone. William Parker. Robert Hayes. George Turner. So many others. These Marines didn't hold because they were fearless. They held because retreat meant others would die. Every hour they stood was another family saved. Every minute they fought was another child who got to grow up. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be a Marine. He saw tears in the crowd. Parents holding children who would never have been born if not for those 40 fallen heroes. Old men and women who owed their lives to a platoon of strangers. "The galaxy thought we were soft," James continued. "They thought humans were too new, too weak to stand against real threats. Kara's Ridge proved them wrong. 47 Marines faced 60,000 enemies and held them back long enough to save every single civilian. Not because we were stronger. Not because we had better weapons. But because we refused to break." Emily Watson stepped forward and placed a wreath at the base of the memorial. Thomas Wright saluted, his rebuilt arm moving stiffly but steady. One by one, the survivors paid their respects. "They held the line," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "And in doing so, they showed the universe what humanity is capable of. They will never be forgotten." "Oorah," the crowd responded, thousands of voices speaking as one. "Oorah." The survivors shouted back, tears streaming down their faces. Later that evening, James stood alone at the memorial, running his fingers over the carved names. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. In the distance, he could see the lights of the rebuilt colony, life returning to a place that had known only death. "I hope we made you proud," James whispered to the names on the stone. A hand touched his shoulder. Emily Watson stood beside him, looking up at the memorial. "They would be proud," she said quietly. "We held. That's all they asked." "Do you think it was worth it? All those lives lost?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she pointed to the colony in the distance. "See those lights? Each one is a family having dinner together. Kids doing homework. People living their lives. That's what we bought with blood. That's what they died for. Was it worth it? She looked at him. Ask those 14,000 people if it was worth it. James nodded slowly. She was right. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. Sometimes the only way to save everything was to sacrifice everything. Staff Sergeant, Emily said, using his old rank out of habit. What do we do now? James looked at the sunset, then at the memorial, then back at the young sergeant who had frozen in her first battle and become a hero by the end. We live, he said simply. We honor their memory by living the best lives we can. And if we're ever called to stand again, we answer that call. Because that's what Marines do. Emily smiled, the expression transforming her scarred face. Oorah. Oorah, James agreed. They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars came out.